Hello, I'm Todd Lamaran, and welcome to Nation. For the last decade, survivors of the notorious St. Anne's Residential School in Northern Ontario have been fighting the Canadian government in court for access to documents. They detail everything from abuse to persons of interest reports. It's something the survivors want released, but adding to their stress are concerns the documents will be destroyed. And one survivor says this also includes documents like her medical records. Evelyn Korkmaz is Mushkegowik Cree and was severely abused at the age of 10. She joins us now from her home in Ottawa. Welcome to Nation, Ms. Korkmaz.
Thank you for having me, Todd.
The St. Anne's Residential School finally shut down in 1976. Can you tell us a bit of when you attended and for how long?
I attended St. Anne's Residential School, which is located in a community, a First Nations community called Fort Albany, Ontario, on the west coast of James Bay, from 1969 to 1972.
St. Anne's wasn't too far from your community of Fort Albany First Nation. I take it all the kids were forced to attend.
Yes, all of us were forced to attend, and it was right in our home community. Fort Albany consists of two islands and one mainland, and the school was located on the mainland. So it was we could walk to school if we wanted to, but we were forced to go into residential school. There were people from our community that attended, as well as the communities along the west coast of James Bay, like Attawapascut, Winnisk, or what they call Bionic right now, Moosonee, Moose Factory. Yeah, they came from all up the coast.
So all up and down James Bay, and it sounds like.
Yes.
St. Anne's, of course, is notorious because of reports of an electric chair that was used as punishment. What do you know about that?
Well, when I was growing up in Fort Albany, I had heard about the electric chair, but I did not see it myself, but there were stories going around about it. So that was like way back in, 1969 to 1970. That I would hear these stories.
Now I want to get into what exactly happened to you when you were 10 years old.
I'm what the IAP calls student-on-student abuse. So I was abused by students. I was gang raped constantly from 1969 to 1972. It's hard to talk about. It's something that happens to you, when you're a child, and even though, 50 odd some years later, it feels like it was just yesterday. And it's very difficult to talk about. But if you want to hear my story, there's a documentary I did called In Jesus' Name by Susan Emberg. And APTN has agreed to post it on their website.
Oh, I'm sure we'll put a link to that document.
Yes.
And I understand, yes, if you don't want to, certainly I don't expect you to get into details about what you suffered. I have noticed you have a bit of a speech impediment, and I've heard it's connected to the abuse you suffered. Do you want to tell me anything about that?
Yes, well, as a child, as we all know, because we were all once children, you don't realize that you're being raped. You think you're getting beaten up or whatever, and it's pretty scary because you don't make sense of it until you're in your adulthood. And because I was frightened, I feel that this is where my speech impediment has come from.
Have you put to rest that? Have you come to terms with what happened to you when you were a child?
Well, it's something, a survivor, whether you're Indigenous or not, because there's a lot of sexual survivors. It's something that's ongoing for the rest of your life. It's something that I'm going to carry and have to live with until the day I'm gone. You know, it's not something you can put on the shelf and say, okay, you know, I got to get on with it. It's you have your good days and you have your bad days. And there's, you know, things that make you remember, like smells, sounds, my speech impediment. So it's something I deal with on a daily basis.
Now to move on to just a bit, something a little bit differently, and that's in 2011 you appeared before an adjudicator where you had to basically testify to your abuse. What was that like?
Oh, it was a nightmare. On February 15, 2011, I had my hearing here in Ottawa, and my adjudicator was Mr. Andre Bouchard, and he was French. He had a very, very strong French accent, and he had broken English. His background was a civil lawyer. And before my hearing started, because I arrived early, we sat down and had a cup of coffee together. And, you know, he told me off the record, because my hearing hadn't started yet. So he told me he was a devout Catholic, and him and his family went to church religiously every Sunday. And he also told me that he went to Fort Albany to tour St. Anne's Residential School and had tea with the nuns. Oh, I knew I was doomed the minute he told me that he was a devout Catholic. Also, he was very abusive, and he was rude, abusive, and hostile, and disrespectful towards me and my lawyer. You know, I feel I was, you know, being re-victimized.
Well, after all that experience with this adjudicator, you did appeal. Your claim was approved and you received some financial compensation. However, you quickly joined another fight to help get records released. Why was that?
Canada was ordered in 2014 to release unredacted documents of the history and the abuse that took place at St. Anne's residential schools, particularly the persons of interest report, which they have not done, you know, till, you know, well, they haven't done it, period. These documents, to me, is very important. It is our Indigenous history. And we need to teach all Canadians and the world how Canada has been treating the Indigenous Canadians and how they have been violating our human rights. There are things in these documents that Canada does not want people to know.
Other than these persons of interest records you've been talking about, are there any others that you're hoping to get?
Yes, there are documentations of people that witnessed, like priests, nuns, bishops, people from the Canadian Air Force, because we had a radar station up in Fort Albany at that time. And they witnessed these things. So it's documented in those files of the personal interest report. And the government doesn't want to release this because, you know, they weren't included in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So they're most likely worried about another class action suit. from my point of view.
After all these years, what's it been like having to fight the federal government every step of the way?
Well, being Indigenous, we all know that, our lives are not easy, when it comes to respecting our rights as First Nations people, especially when we fall under the Indian Act, which is a very racist policy or legislation. But I've gone to Rome to request the Pope to respond to the TRC in apologizing to our people in their role in violating our human rights. But that hasn't happened yet. But I will continue to ask him to do so. Our people deserve it.
I'm sure you will keep fighting. And finally, Ms. Korkmaz, I understand it's your birthday this weekend, so I want to thank you for not only coming on Nation to Nation, but happy birthday.
Thank you so much.
After the break, we speak to NDP MP Charlie Angus on the race to stop these documents from being destroyed. Welcome back. We just heard a horrific story of abuse from a survivor of the former notorious St. Anne's Residential School in Northern Ontario. But it was also one of strength and courage. Now we focus on what the federal government is or isn't doing with those documents survivors have been trying to get for years. And for all those years, NDP MP Charlie Angus has been a vocal advocate for the survivors. And he joins us now from Cobalt, Ontario. Mr. Angus, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you so much for having me on such an important issue as the St. Anne survivors.
You keep saying the government is about to destroy key records these survivors are in court to get. What's going on there?
The government was looking on January 1st to begin destroying all the documents relating to the IEP, and that would include all the persons of interest reports, the POI reports that are crucial in the St. Anne's cases, because it was the decision by the Justice Department to go into the hearings with the St. Anne survivors with a false evidence narrative. They had an obligation to present all the evidence of the crimes that were committed, and they claimed there were no crimes. Of course, we know that was false. There was a massive police investigation. The government was sitting on thousands and thousands of pages of documents, including these POI reports of notorious predators. So the government was going to begin to destroy all this, which would make the justice that the St. Anne survivors are seeking impossible. The government has blinked on that, thanks to a huge outcry from across the country. But, at what point will the government just stop these stupid legal battles and have Carolyn Bennett call the survivors and sit down and negotiate a fair solution? That's the question.
Just before the Christmas break, we did have Justice Minister David Lametti on Nation to Nation, and he said the notion that feds will destroy records is utterly false. What do you say to that?
Well, they were moving forward with it, and we shone a light on them. So I'm really glad David Lametti got the chokey chokes on that. But we have seen nothing but obstruction and interference from the Justice Department. Mr. Lametti, I like him. He's a good man, but he's following in a long, dismal pattern. Carolyn Bennett, I like her. She's following in the same pattern of supporting the obstruction that's gone on. How could you have a legal process where the defendant, which is Canada, could go into the hearings and lie about the evidence and suppress the evidence, have people who are really decent, good people who came forward, like Evelyn Korkmaz, to tell their story and have their cases thrown out because the evidence was suppressed? How can you stand there and say that was a fair process? It was a complete sham, a legal kangaroo circus. So the issue here is, what's it going to take for David Lametti and Carolyn Bennett to say the government did wrong to the St. Anne survivors? The St. Anne survivors have been calling for them to just come to the table and settle this and fix it.
Lametti also said it was only some survivors who sought to have the ability to shred their records. Has this whole issue kind of spun out of context?
Well, David Lametti doesn't have a clue what survivors want or don't want because he won't talk to them. So he's in no position to say that. The issue is that the survivors, led by the incredible Dr. Edmund Matatawaban, who called for the original police investigation at St. Anne's, has reached out to government time and time again to say everybody knows that the government lied in the hearings. Everybody knows that the independent assessment process, which was supposed to bring healing to the survivors of St. Anne's, was a total farce. And we know that many cases were thrown out. So due diligence and basic legal principles tell us that the government is obligated to fix this massive injustice to the survivors. They did no wrong. Their only crime in the eyes of the government was when they were young. They were Indian children. And now, as grandparents and survivors, they're pissing the government off because they will not bend, they will not go away, and they are proudly looking the government in the face and saying, you have to fix the damage you've done. That's the call. And I'm waiting, and I still believe the government at one point will realize it cannot win against the moral power of these survivors, people like Evelyn Korkmaz and Edmund Matatawaban and Angela Shishish and all the other survivors. They're not going away, so let's fix this.
What is the first thing that the government should do to fix this, then? What is the very first step that they should be doing?
Well, the lawyers for the survivors have reached out time and time again to say, enough of the court cases. Let's sit down and find a way to address the fact that the hearings were a farce because the government suppressed all the evidence and people who should have gotten compensated didn't get compensated. That can be done. The survivors have reached out to Senator Murray Sinclair, of course, is famous for his work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He's called out the government. We're hoping Murray Sinclair will work with us to try and bring the government to the table. Otherwise, we're going back into court probably in a few weeks. We have a court hearing in British Columbia. There's a court hearing in Ontario. And the government is losing. They're losing all these court cases. They've spent millions fighting the St. Anne survivors. At what point do they realize they're on the absolute wrong side of history? Do the right thing. Say these person of interest reports are key evidence to the hearings that were thrown out, a horrific abuse that was committed. This is the historic record, and it's a record that Canada owes the survivors, not just of St. Anne's, but all First Nation people who are still suffering with the legacies of the residential schools. They owe it to do the right thing.
Well, we certainly appreciate what you do when you come on our show. Mr. Angus, thank you.
Thank you so much.
After the break, we speak to Cindy Blackstock about her ongoing fight for equality for First Nations children. Welcome back. Last November, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal issued an order. It expanded the eligibility of children who could seek help under Jordan's principle. For example, even if children themselves don't have Indian status, if their parents or guardians do have status, then they're eligible to receive help. That's just one example. But just before Christmas, the federal government asked for a judicial review of that order. To talk more about it, it's Cindy Blackstock, Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Ms. Blackstock, welcome to Nation.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Now, Indigenous Services says the review is because the tribunal expanded the definition of who is a First Nations child without consulting communities. You call that explanation bogus. Why is that?
Because First Nations communities have already spoken about Jordan's principle, and they've also been clear that they're the ones to determine who is their members. What the ruling from the tribunal said is that First Nations children without status, but who are recognized by their communities, ought to receive services for Jordan's principle. Another thing the tribunal said is that First Nations who need help, financial supports, to be able to set up that recognition process should be able to receive that from the Government of Canada. And the third important thing that the tribunal said is by recognizing these children without status, resident off reserve, you're doing so only for the purposes of Jordan's principle. And when you do recognize them, it doesn't mean that another child gets less. It means that just more children finally get their needs met. So there's no real downside to this ruling. I haven't heard First Nations really protesting this ruling at all. I think this is just Canada being unwilling to accept responsibility for its ongoing duties to First Nations kids. And they want to deny them help, which is so desperately needed. And it's sad that they have to continue to do this.
Now, Indigenous Services says the expanded eligibility remains in place for Jordan's principal while the review is going on. Are you worried that if the review goes against you, that some children who used to get help under Jordan's principle might not get it?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm worried about. I mean, right now, Canada is saying, just trust us. We'll make sure these kids get the services, but we know that doesn't really work out very well for First Nations kids in the past. And if they were really going to do the right thing, then why would they even worry about there being a legal order? I mean, it's a legal order saying about something you're willing to do. So I think that there is a real risk here that some First Nations children who will be denied services under Jordan's principle if Canada is successful in this judicial review. And I should just let people know that we're going to do everything in our power to make sure they're not successful by presenting arguments in favor of the children, and that people are still eligible right now to receive those services. So they should put those requests in there and get their kids' needs met.
What happens if worse comes to worse and the judicial review disagrees with you?
Well, then we still have a chance to appeal, and we will be appealing that decision up to the Federal Court of Appeal. I just think, Todd, after how many years has Canada been around? Over 153 years. It's time they stop chaining children's identities to that racist Indian Act for the provision of services. These are First Nations children. They're recognized by their nations, and they ought to be receiving services. So we're prepared to continue to push it as far as it needs to go to get justice for these kids.
Now, how does this all affect First Nations who are drafting their own child welfare laws under C-92, which has been law for just over a year now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question in two ways. One is we cross-examined one of Canada's witnesses last week, and the question was asked, will First Nations who draw down their own laws still be able to benefit from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal's funding principles, things like substantive equality, needs-based, taking into context the unique circumstances of their community, and of course, Jordan's principle? And the answer back from the Government of Canada was, well, you're going to have to argue that point, which means likely that we're going to have to litigate that point, that they're not prepared to really extend those benefits, which is very disturbing to me. The second thing is that many First Nations define their members by their own membership codes, and it's not according to the Indian Act. So if there's an act under C-92, it's still really unclear what Canada will do for First Nations children who are members of a First Nation being served under those laws but are resident off reserve. Who's going to fund that is still a huge question, and whether that funding will be equitable and whether that funding will be sufficient for those children to get full enjoyment of all the rights and services that they're entitled to under First Nations laws.
Okay, as always, it's great to talk to you. Thank you, Ms. Blackstock.
Thank you for having me, Todd. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. That's our show for this week. I hope you're staying safe and healthy. I'm Todd Lameran. Thanks for watching.